All right, get to the presentation. All right, well, how do you put over 6 months of crazy crammed into a presentation? The answer is you can't. I need 10 minutes at least for every month we went by with almost the stuff that has happened. I won't be able to begin to touch everything that has happened, but you're welcome to engage and ask questions, and I'll do some pivots. We do like to do social media. There's a lot of people who can't be here. There's people that you're connected to that would be useful to have information. So I'd encourage you to use social media. To do that, I would love for you to use KSEcon. I'll try to retweet or put it on LinkedIn, try to like it. To get you encouraged, I put my favorite hashtag, which was doom scrolling. Have anyone heard that? I see some nods, yeah. Doom scrolling. Everyone did it. You probably looked at your phone this morning. What was the next doomsday news, right? That's the 2020 hashtag there. I asked my two teenagers their favorites. One said quarantine, which is actually kind of funny. And the other was maskne. Anyone heard that? Mask acne. That's a popular one amongst the teenagers. So anyway, definitely gonna put some up there. Extra points if you can come up with an economics related one. And there are some out there. I always do this. What was the slide I presented last year? Try to give you context. The first question is, what was I thinking when I said the Kansas economy is going to grow by 0.6% this year? If you remember, I spent most of last year starting to think about when is the next recession. I actually put indicators on my website for when we might have a next recession. I got concerned. I did a survey of businesses across the state. By the way, the majority of businesses said we would have a recession in 2020. But when I pushed back on them, no one could come up with a reason. I asked this group, what would our next recession be? When and what would it be? And no one came up with the answer, COVID. I had some good answers, but no one came up with COVID as the reason why we would go into a recession. So what was my theme last year? Last year I said this health checkup. I was starting to get worried. Businesses were getting worried about when the next recession would be. So if you did it, all the vital signs, and really the fundamentals were behind it. Not only the fundamentals were behind it, we had that weak growth in Kansas, and even here you're starting to sink, probably a mini recession here because of oil and gas, but things were starting to take off and it looked really good. I thought we'd see a lot of improvements in the labor market and more growth in the Kansas economy. So the fundamentals are there, we just got diverted because of COVID. So what's the theme for this year? I could only think of one thing, a Shakespearean tragedy. That's what it has felt like, right? And every Shakespearean tragedy has 5 acts, so I broke it up into 5 sections. And the first one I did was supernatural forces. And if you think about Shakespeare, supernatural forces, anyone likes Macbeth? Macbeth and witches, Hamlet and ghosts. 2020 is, oh, come on. What's our supernatural force this year? COVID, there you go. So I thought I would talk about COVID. I think it's actually important, because you've all done all that doom scrolling, you saw all that news. Let's look at some data to see how much of that really happened. Let's put some clarity to that at the national level. If January was 100%, and then we move forward all the way as employment, move forward to April, you can see leisure and hospitality dropped down to 51%. We lost 49. And then it was picking back up. That was that hard hit sector. So yes, we heard that, that's true, and it's still struggling today, right? The one sector that almost saw no loss in employment was the bankers, and that's because they were too busy doing PPP loans and housing refinancing and things like that. So if you laid them off, they didn't even see that layoff notice, I suppose. All right, this is a different lens, and this is one that we heard some big stories about, and unfortunately, there's a lot of truth to those stories, right? When you look at segments of the workforce, who got impacted the most, females were impacted more, minorities were impacted more, and those people with less education. Why? It goes back to the previous slide. Those hard-to-hit sectors are the ones that would more likely have women and minorities and lower education associated with it. And that's why they got hit a lot harder than other sectors. Now there's some broad macro trends going on right now. That teleworking world, right? People working more from home. Urban de-densification. Have you heard the stories about people leaving in parts of California and New York, just massively leaving? Automation replacing those skills when you say there's just too much risk, I'm just going to replace it. If those happen, there are some economists saying, well, those types of jobs in those urban areas, and by the way, that's not just New York and California, it's in Kansas City, it's in even Hayes, right? Think about those office professional services jobs, and then look at those support jobs behind them. administrative assistants, security guards, right? That hospitality, hotels, right? In those urban areas like here, those jobs have the upward mobility. And there's concerns that we just destroyed those jobs, we hurt these types of people, and maybe they may not have that opportunity to move up that they've had historically, been great opportunities to move up in the workforce and get skills. But if you remember Shakespeare's plays, the theme of the environment from the beginning to the end of all plays always change. And I don't think we should say, look in the rearview mirror and say, this is the exact same way our economy is going to move forward. I think labor has changed a lot. And so I'm going to give you some different points as we go through. All right, I love this first slide. And I want you to see, if I asked everyone, did income skyrocket in the second quarter during COVID? No, I doubt anyone would say yes, but it did. And I want you to look at the scale. I did nothing to the scale. Income skyrocketed in second quarter in Kansas, in the Plains area, in the US, particularly you can see in the Plains area went up extremely high. What is that? So you can look at the components of personal income. I only put two of them on here. Earnings. This is earnings, wages, earned income, right? And transfer of receipts. If you look at earnings, it looks like it declined a little bit, but it actually declined a whole lot. It's just the scale is so off that you can't even tell. So if we look at earnings, yes, we lost a lot of those jobs. Those earnings dropped, and it hurt. Transfer receipts, this is back when we were talking about this other question. What is that? This is federal government. That's the unemployment insurance at the federal and state level, right? And so when you, going back all the way when that first came out, I was scared to death when I heard $600. I had the Workforce Center ask me, what would this do in Kansas? And 78% of Kansans were better off on unemployment insurance than actually working at that point in time. Didn't matter if they're going to be laid off or not. It was such a windfall of cash that it really was more of an incentive to be on unemployment. Now, when you look at this and start thinking about the economy over the summer, and I know most of you felt this, as we got out of the lockdown and people started moving around, the economy started feeling a little bit better, right? As we moved into the fall, we started moving and feeling a little bit better again. A lot of this has to do because the economy heavily propped up from income through unemployment insurance. Now, unemployment insurance itself, it doesn't matter if you're really which side, Republican or Democrat, most economists will say this is the most effective and efficient way of getting cash out during recessions. And it was very effective and efficient, getting to the people who really needed that cash. But the unemployment insurance has already dropped in July, right? And so we've already ran out of that. So when I said the Fed, we're already going into the fall, we're still feeling good. What's going on? Income went up so high. If you look at savings rate kept going up and up and up. And so those people who weren't even really laid off, their incomes went up really high, and they've been burning off the savings the last 2 months, right? So they're floating the economy from the income that was injected back in this other period. My concern is, and this is my big but here, is if without another stimulus package and really soon, all this cash is really going to come crashing. That's why the Federal Reserve said just 2 weeks ago, this is critical, you've got to do it. And unfortunately, I did this forecast and now I'm turning my position because it does not look like we're going to have it before the election. And if that doesn't happen, I didn't look at the news this morning. Did we have a stimulus package? And because of that, that makes me really concerned about what the economy is going to look like. So my whole forecast is based on a stimulus package, which I had to do a couple weeks ago when I started this presentation series. But now I'm looking to a much more negative outlook, particularly coming into this fourth quarter. So.
You just asked us all to go doom scroll.
Yeah, go doom scrolling. That's the next negative news. All right, I have good news sort of right here. Impact of COVID on employment in Kansas. Employment did not decline as much as the US and has already come back up a little bit. So I was asked back in April to do an impact study. What was all the companies in Kansas by region, how much production would be lost, how much employment would be lost. And I did say, because we turned that into employment forecast in May, and I said, I think Kansas can decline by 10.2% in the state. And I was wrong, it was good news. But I actually think there's some reasons why I think I'm right, which I'm going to prove later. The question is why I was wrong. And let me tell you why. First thing is, I had to make it a simplifying assumption. I had to assume that we're going to get the same PPP loans as every other, based on number of businesses that every other state would have, and the same number of stimulus checks. And I was wrong on both accounts. I've got plenty of slides. You want to see it? We got a whole lot more PPP loans, partly because we have hard-hit industries, but it's because we had small and medium banks that were much more efficient and more connected and got the funding out faster. Same thing with stimulus checks. We got more stimulus checks than that. Because of those two factors, it helped hold on a lot of jobs than I had anticipated with it. And even though I did include that, it held up a lot more jobs than I expected. Another thing there where I was wrong is that, and I'll show you later, businesses in Kansas were more financially capitalized. They had more cash on hand and more ready to deal with this downturn than the nation, which I'll show you later. And a third item is when I did a panel, businesses said we were already very tight on the labor market versus the US. They were already full. They had marginal workers they could lay off easily. We felt we couldn't lay them off here, so we held on to them. We actually had a tendency to do that. In 2008, we did the same thing. The nation laid off a lot more. Even though we were hard hit, we held on to labor and then kept laying them off slowly. So when you look at going forward, the US did do a big layoff. They're already coming back up. We didn't do a full layoff, really. And you can see that employment is really lagging now at the state level and in the regions too. All right, what is the outlook? We really cannot have an outlook until we first get the solution to COVID, right? When's the vaccine and when is the dissemination? And I looked up the latest numbers on this, and I would encourage you to go look at this. They pay people, not experts, but they get paid for accuracy. So they're out there every single day trying to figure out when this is going to happen. It shifted, and it shifted a little bit more negative, unfortunately, as we go forward. They are saying 53%, it actually is down to like 48%. Think we'll have a solution by the end of this school year, and then another 38, and that actually moved up a little bit by the beginning of next school year. So if you're a business, particularly one that deals with a lot of in-person traffic, right, you have to be highly connected, that's going to slow down the economy for, not my forecast, but for a very long time until we get a real good solution on that. All right, so the first act, we talked about these supernatural forces. And one thing about Shakespeare is he never lets the supernatural force to be the whole theme of the play, right? It is only used to understand the character flaw of our hero. And in this case, I'm going to use this. Supernatural forces doesn't define our labor force, but it definitely shows us where the issues are within our labor force. At a company level, right? Some of you are dealing with issues in your company level, or even at a state level, we have other issues within the labor market. So let's talk about that character flaw, some of those issues. Unemployment, and actually I did an update with the data that came out today. But if you look at unemployment rates, it was all the way up to 14.7% back in April, came down to 8.4%, and I didn't have a chance to look at today's data. Another way to say this is we lost around 22 million jobs. We added back 11 million jobs at the national level, right? So we're improving, labor market's healing, but there's still a lot of people out there. There's a lot of people unemployed. And you can say the same for around the state. I like this. Here's a different lens to look at, something I don't usually do. I look at unemployment insurance claims, and I divide it by 1,000 workers that are in that sector. So what I want to show you is 3 distinct different labor markets already. So you go back to January, construction workers, for every 1,000 construction workers, there's 5.4 that had initial unemployment claims in that week, right? That was off season, right? This is not seasonally adjusted. This is a sign. Look how very few people there were available in January. That's a very tight labor market. You move forward to the peak. This is right at the end of March. That was the peak of the initial unemployment claims. Manufacturing, for every 1,000 manufacturing workers in Kansas, almost 85 were unemployed. If I actually broke this down further, it wasn't on the food side, it was all on the durable side. It would be even higher if I got on the durable side versus the food side. There was lots more layoffs on that side of this equation. But the biggest one is that accommodations and food services, eating out. They quickly laid tons of people off. For every 1,092, 93 people were laid off in that sector, right? That was a sign of when we did the lockdown, we initially saw COVID, it was a unique labor market, right? People who were laid off and people who were needed were unique to that period. I'm saying these 3 distinct ones because we're thinking COVID being all the same, but the labor market's different today than it was all the way back in March. And when we get to January, it's going to be different again. What we're seeing is as the market started opening up, right? Particularly here in this accommodations, we started hiring people back, but they're not necessarily the highest ones anymore. It's now shifting to other sectors. And I'm going to show you that again later on. There are other sectors that are finding they bring people back and they're finding demand to be weaker than it is, and they're still doing layoffs, right? So that labor market's shifting around there. All right. We saw the national level. This looks at unemployment insurance claims per thousand, but it gives us a very unique look at Kansas. And here we have a different story. At the national, it was women. Here you can see men and women were both at the peak, right? But today, look at the difference in the labor market now. Men are increasing more per thousand than women. Why is that? This is the manufacturing. We had held on to a lot of these manufacturing jobs, did all these furloughs, and now the manufacturing seeing demand, trade issues, all that starting to weaken, and they're starting to lay more off, more, which just gets a different environment. At the national level is more of a minority issue. Here is less just the broad minority, and this is really one group that's being impacted the most, and that's black. And then you look at over here, here's a whole nother story, and I think this is very interesting. Again, this is not total volume. This is just impact per person in the categories. People that are older in their career, people with more education are now being laid off today. Right, so what's the point here? If you're a business and you were needing skilled labor, guess what's happening? Right now there's skilled labor, mostly in that manufacturing that's out there and available for work. It may not be in your community, but there's some skilled older workforce that is available. All right, the census did a survey, and they have some great data. They had surveys of households on anxiety, on depression, on finances. And if I looked at all those, and I have data on them, if you want to see it, I can send it to you. They all increased for the nation and for Kansas. And for almost all of them, Kansas wasn't impacted as high as the nation. So that's good news. Our households are doing better than the nation. There's only one that I saw in here that I thought was interesting, that we had a unique factor here. And that was when it came to being laid off or furloughed, we had a higher level of people that were often without food in Kansas. This is broken down even further. I can even tell you when they're having food and where they're getting it from. And in Kansas, we're actually, the nation, they're getting more from family, from churches, and here it wasn't there. We had a lot less in that infrastructure. It was more coming from structured ones of food banks, things like that. I heard someone talking about it earlier, about their food bank. I don't know where it was. Someone was talking about it. But there are definitely some issues here within Kansas. This is more of a community issue. If people are often without food, think about the struggles they're having for crime that could happen in communities, for engaging them in the labor market, for their kids being aware and focused in schools, right? We have a community issue if this is more significant. And there is a volume enough of people out there that are struggling with food that we need to think about. All right, have you been to these events over the last 11 years? And I know I've been here, seen quite a few of you again. There is, I love the employment population ratio. Because under the unemployment data, you can just give up, right? You can stop looking for a job and you're not counted and it looks like you're at full employment. But employment population ratio, I take everyone employed and everyone that's over 18. I don't care who you are, how old you are, just divide by the two and you can't hide from it. And it tells me a lot more, and it actually has a more unique story to Kansas than the nation. If you back up to 2008, we were so much higher than the nation. Go 2008, we dropped so much more than the nation. We had a lot more people that were not engaged in the labor market, but unemployment was really low. The nation was improving slowly right away. We kept really low there for a while. We were still laying people off, and then we were finally healing and coming back up. What you should look and gain from this is you can see the drop in it, right? You see that we're recovering from this, but we still have a ways to go. Matter of fact, we can easily get Kansas City, I say easy, but Kansas City was clearly a tight labor market around that 52 benchmark. So we still have people that were, when we said it was a tight labor market, I've pushed back every year. I know we've had this conversation here before, and I want you to push back on me. Still, there are people out there. They might not be the exact person you want. They might require some training and some education or some other factors to get them re-engaged in the labor market. But there are people available that were not engaged in the labor market. All right, I say that, and as I went around, I had a conversation, and people are saying, yeah, but I have jobs that I cannot get filled, And some of you know someone in the household side who had someone that just putting applications out and cannot get a job. So the question is, why is it employers have jobs they can't fill, and in households that have, they're out there looking for jobs and they can't get a job, right? Is there the quality of the workforce poor, or do we have unrealistic expectations? And really, everyone's pointing to this unemployment benefits. I already shared 78% of us would have been better off on unemployment. I was scared to death. I thought this was going to be the worst thing ever for Kansas because it would disencourage people from being engaged in the labor market. There's already been national research saying, at the whole, this is not the primary factor. There are people on the margins clearly going to take advantage of that. But at the whole, people were afraid of the labor markets. They stayed engaged, being actively looking for jobs. And when they were called, they had to go back. So they were actively engaged. We saw that labor engagement on there. So the question is, what's really going on? I think it's actually a little easier. We had such a shock to this economy, right? It was such a jolt to it that your labor supply and demand just don't equal within a regional market, right? Or within an industry, right? You have one industry over here and they have people over here, they just doesn't fit with this other industry somewhere else in your community, right? Think about when you have Thanksgiving. So a lot of people do like to do puzzles. Imagine taking two sets of puzzles, throwing on the same coffee table. It's going to take a long time to sort the two puzzles out first and then piece it back together. The reason why our employment population ratio was down and really not coming back up, at the national level, they hired back the same jobs. In Kansas, we had jobs here that we let go. Oil and gas is an example. You know this in this area. But there are other parts of the state that let go jobs that were never going to come back, right? And people had to get retrained. That created friction, right? It took a lot longer. It took years, and we're still not back to where we were before, right? Before 2008. That labor market hadn't healed. What do I expect? First, the employers have to know, what jobs do I really need going forward? Then they have to increase wages, right? Wages is the first price signal. Then the households then have to say, okay, that's my signal. Now I'm ready to go get education. By the way, we don't have a mass entrance into education right now. So households are hanging back, waiting. Then they'll engage in the labor market, which could take 1 year, 4 years, depends on what needs to be out there. And then it could heal. So we got a ways before the labor market's going to heal if you're going to just do that natural process. All right, when we look at the impact of COVID across the state, you get a very distinct story. The urban communities were impacted a whole lot more than the more rural parts of the state. Matter of fact, the rural parts of the state are either back to zero or a little bit above zero compared to they were in January. That tight labor market issue that we've talked about before here, right? When they got laid off in these more urban areas, guess what? There's some shifts going back to those rural areas. There were already shifts. I talked to you about that last year where I saw migration, people moving more to the rural areas because wages were starting to come up and you're starting to attract people back to rural areas. I saw that migration back. That just continued a little further this year, and I imagine it's going to continue for more as that de-urbanization, people moving out of the urban areas. So you can fill those jobs. This is the opportunity to really attract that labor back. All right, Act 3. The dichotomy of good and evil. Shakespeare always poses those two forces. And if you think about that supernatural force on Macbeth, right? You have the supernatural forces of witches, a good person being influenced by it and slowly turning evil. And what we don't want is our industries to be, and we have great industries from oil and gas or animal health or you can keep going. We have all these great industries. The longer we go, how hard is COVID going to wear down on these industries and create some more issues? So I'm going to show you a couple. This one breaks all kinds of rules to have on any type of slide ever presented, but it was so beautiful. I just thought I had to put it on here. It's like a picture for me, a painting. So the thing you should take away, when you move up the scale, that was the ones that were the hardest hit. You can see that top one, arts and entertainment. You go all the way to April, and this is employment, year over year, big drop off, right? It is a really big drop off, declined by 51%. And still year over year is still well below where it was, right? That's one story. Another one, which I think is helpful to see, month over month, yes, it dropped, but that same sector was increasing every single month, doing better, better, better every month. However, you move down the scale, they weren't impacted as much early on. They're the ones that are out there scrambling. Right? Someone said, I don't understand the economy today. They're the ones that are saying, I keep turning and the economy is weaker than I expected. So I'm laying off. I'm now laying off. I'm now laying off. I'm now laying off. I thought I could keep them on, but I'm just running out of cash, right? This is the part that really describes the chaos that we're feeling today than it was back in COVID, right? It's not all one economy. It is dynamically changing is what I'm trying to tell you, right? And I think it's going to continue to change as we move forward, even if we have changes in the presidential election. All right, remember I said that impact of employment, we weren't impacted as much. I said I was going to come back to it. This is the output side, right? This is the value of all the goods and services. The US declined by 31% in the second quarter. Kansas declined by 30.3%. So I was actually getting pretty close to what was right. I actually said, unlike the US, I said manufacturing was going to be our hardest hit one here in Kansas. I actually thought healthcare was going to hit pretty hard, right? I got the idea of it. I even got almost the scale right, but we held on to labor. If you look at output per worker, we would have been a lot closer to that 10.2% than I expected. We just held on to labor. So what's the takeaway? Well, the US economy was less in manufacturing, as more in those hard-hit sectors. As long as cash flows, those sectors are going to jump back faster. We're in sectors over here that are going to take a lot more. Just in time, which was the golden era before, is now killing manufacturing today, where they cannot get the goods. They're getting all kinds of disruptions. Then they're having doing their stoppages on their plant floor, right? There's all kinds of issues here. So I think that's going to weigh us down as we move forward, unlike the nation. So it's going to be a little harder going forward, a little slower. But I've got good news. The census did these surveys of businesses. They asked them how hard hit were they by establishment. We were less impacted. Now, if we weighted this to manufacturing, it'd probably be a different story. But overall, establishments less impacted. And we were more financially capitalized. We had more cash on hand. We were better prepared for a downturn than the nation. I asked the businesses several questions. I do the survey every year. Asked them the economic environment. And they said the volume was down, of course. They expect the volume to come up for some of them, but not for all of them. Remember the previous slides. Input costs are really going to be hard, particularly manufacturing ones that are having all kinds of trade issues. They see a lot of barriers there. When the price they get to the customer, they said, we are just not going to be able to increase it. If you're not going to be able to increase it and you still see a lot of weaknesses, that means profit margins are going to really struggle this next year. Businesses expect a really long haul of going forward, of really taking a hit and not having big profits, right? But we had several years there where profit margins were pretty strong. So there's some money in the bank to help some of the companies. Our forecast, unfortunately, usually we can look at industries and talk about oil and gas or talk about agriculture. That really goes out the window. Broadly speaking, my model says we're going to see growth. Even some subsectors are going to see growth. But the real story is the micro level. This is going to go back to the bankers and the economic developers to really solve the problems. Because if a business, even if they expect it to grow, they could have made one small step with their finances and they're already out and they're going to have to go bankrupt, right? That's the level that we're going to deal with. And that's the part I can't really predict, right? It's on the very micro level business. Even if their industry is growing, they could have made a misstep and then really struggle and go into bankruptcy. All right. Act 4, fate and fortune. Shakespeare likes this idea of predestination, but the hero gets to choose their way. And our hero, we're talking about businesses. If you think about the businesses in this context, or like Macbeth was overly ambitious. When I did our panel survey, our businesses here are very conservative. Every time I talk to businesses across the state, super conservative. They're going to hold on cash. They're going to be very careful and not taking big bets. So we have a very different outlook. I was surprised by this. I asked them, what are you going to do about wages in the future? I was surprised on the share of businesses said, we're increasing wages. So I asked them, why are you doing this? The environment changed. Remember last year when I talked about it and the previous year when I talked about increasing wages? It was because they needed that high-skilled worker and they were finally ready to start increasing that wage. There's more competition in the state. Because remember, in these previous years, we were a lot lower than the nation. We actually had, if you take out inflation, we had negative growth rates in wages, and then we all of a sudden started coming up. Okay? It's not the high-skilled one today. It's this middle-skilled and lower-skilled workers They said that they were starting to really compete on and starting to put more wages to it. And they were willing to put more training behind that as well. That's a big shift. Remember I said that whole labor market is more dynamic and that upward mobility? This is a sign that businesses said, yes, I need bodies, and it doesn't have to be the highest skilled today, which is different than what we were thinking about last year, or even in January. All right, our forecasts, we showed you in previous slide, we're going to lose some higher income earners. We might have some growth in some of the lower and middle income, but that's going to put flat on our wage growth. Our forecast for taxable retail sales, it looks positive, but keep in mind our taxable retail sales in Kansas is way low compared to the nation. The nation was going straight up for these years that was coming down. This is a lot of pent up demand. After the election, we're going to finally go and spend some money, probably the second quarter of next year, get some of that spending that really had to be spent anyway. Those things that you needed. All right, what do businesses expect? The majority of them think that it's going to be pretty flat for this next year. We have a larger share of them saying we're going to struggle, right? And then you can see some growth. Those growth ones are in unique sectors where they can position themselves to grow. Our forecast, unfortunately, this is the widest forecast that we've ever put out. And it's because we can't forecast COVID, even though I showed you earlier, and we can't forecast all the changes in the political environment. We can't get involved in all that. It's too hard. I will say both of these have an expectation that we'd have a stimulus package, and that's where I said I'm now concerned my forecast is even wrong. On the bottom case, let's say in this case, our forecast assumes that we still struggle. We get past this election, consumers are still negative. We have some issues with school systems, with outbreaks. We even shut down the markets a little bit. We don't get a solution to COVID in this spring, maybe it's this summer. In that scenario, I think our Kansas economy is going to be best at flat. I mean, there'll be almost zero growth from where we're at now to next year. The alternative is we do have a stimulus package. We do not have any major shutdowns or have to lock down the economy. We get a solution to COVID maybe in the spring sometime, and our economy can accelerate a lot faster to closer to 1.1%. What I'm showing here is more of in the between, right at 0.5%, with a big kick in the second quarter of next year. If you look at a year over year, that keeps us still way below where we were in January. But there's really no expectation we should be growing as fast as we were in January, right? That was at a peak period of our economy. All right, last one, and then I'll switch over to some local data. Here's the paradox of disappointment. Shakespeare loves to do one thing with our human nature. He holds one thing that we really hold true to it. We love hope, right? And he holds it out there and just crushes it. And we enjoy his plays because of it. So I'm not going to crush your hope, unfortunately. Well, fortunately, I'm not going to crush all your hope on this. But I do want to talk about kind of where we're going. I often get the question, what recession best looks like this? And there really is not one. But if we're going to go back and think about structures of economies, I've got one to think about. Go back all the way back to the Black Plague. Think all the way back at that point in time. They had a lot more death than we had, right? In some places they had lost half the population. They shuttered the economy much more than us. But what was the structure of the economy? They had this feudal system. The kings had all the power. If you want to be a cobbler, you could only do it if your great-great-great-great-great-grandson, right? He was within the family. It was within the guild that could do it. What happened when they lost half the population, all of a sudden, someone who was a farm worker could actually get a skill to become a cobbler or some other skill. We had the highest upward mobility in society in a 100-year period than we've seen in the world's history, one of the highest periods. Incomes rose much faster. The economy actually got much stronger. Now think about the last couple decades. What were the concerns of the economy? Well, we had less income equality, right? Large businesses were getting all the power. Medium and small businesses were struggling. I think there's a shift going on. I think there's a lot more opportunity to see the economy grow and to see a new outlook. It won't be as dynamic as it was back then, but I think we'll see some of that shift now. All right, I would love to talk more about entrepreneurship, but a lot of that data we don't know. I think there are people out there because their house values are high, because maybe they had money from the federal stimulus, right? It gave them opportunity to go and say, I can go do it. I can go create a new business. We had a lack of entrepreneurism in Kansas for a while, and the nation. but there's no reason to do it. It was that large business gave us security. We could go right back to that same job. That job is gone for a lot of people. And so some people are out there saying, hey, I am hungry, I am motivated, and I have cash. I could do it better than my employer. And that's what I hope to see. This is just one example. Here's business applications. Even business applications with already planned wages are really high right now. I think this is an indication that we're going to see new growth in maybe some of that small business side. All right, some silver linings. I know people keep talking about this teleworking and some concerns with that, but honestly, especially here, teleworking just opened up your labor pool. It's not physically bound by the county or city. You could use someone from Topeka to come work here through teleworking. If you keep opening up, those people with disabilities, those people with transportation and vehicle issues, you just opened up a labor market, right? If you really look at the silver lining, you had that technology, you applied it, and you keep it, you could actually increase your ability, which also keeps your costs down, by the way. Removal of rules and laws. Telehealth is a great example of this, right? You can now be at home and Medicaid can pay for the costs. The doctor can get paid. But think about all the rules within your company that changed as soon as COVID hit, right? You had to show up at a certain times. All those rules got eliminated. Smaller businesses can take advantage of this and be much more nimble to keep moving back into the market, right? They have access to labor. They can be more nimble. We already know the market's completely changed. And access to the markets, you hear the large businesses talking, although Google controls a lot of that access, but that's not going to be the only solution, right? You see huge competition against Google now from Target and other ones, but smaller players are really trying to eat that up. They're trying to be more competitive. So I see some opportunities there. Take that with this other one, business practices. We had all this software sitting on our shelf. We weren't using it, right? All of a sudden we used it and we got more productivity. If we continue to do it, we could see more productivity gains. What was the concern of the last decade from our expansion? Output per worker, productivity was really flat. We saw very little. People were shocked. They said, we have all this technology. Why isn't it helping us? Well, we weren't really utilizing all that technology at the company level. Those companies that really embraced it, they now have all this technology. If they're using this productivity, using this, it makes the employee more productive. Guess what it's going to do to that middle and lower income workers? It gives them more value added to those workers. That means wages can go up, and we can see a different environment going forward. All right, if I was to think of a broad perspective, I think there's a lot of creative destruction. I think we're going to still lose a lot more industries. I'm sorry about that. It's still going to happen. We're not done yet. We're going to lose a lot of companies still going forward. And I look at the stock market every day and seeing companies their stocks are going down. They're struggling to get cash or get back to a customer, right? A lot of creative destruction. But the best example is ad astra per aspera, right? It is going to be difficult the next year. The companies that we did the survey said, yeah, they're going to struggle. Those companies that have cash and keep making small bets, right? Being very conservative, they're the ones that can make it through this next year. I don't know, I can't remember exactly my time. I think, yeah, we got time. Good. Do we have a question before I go on to local economy? Yeah. This is my water, right? Losing population for what area? You said for Topeka? Oh, yeah. Well, Topeka's been struggling. And what years did you see the decline in? I don't know.
From 2020 to 2070, you
Yeah.
have a reduction in population.
Right. Well, Topeka's been struggling even as the overall economy. You can see employment has been very weak for quite a while, motivated highly from the government side, and government has been declining and has been an underlying base for the Topeka economy that's making that region struggle quite a bit. So the model there, and we just updated this employment forecast model. We are the official one from the census to do that for the state. In that model, all we do is take every single household in there by age and gender, and all we do is we let them age. We let people move in and move out based on the trends of that area. So Topeka has their own migration in and out. And then we let them have births if they have women of a certain age. So it's the own structure, just growing that population cohort over time is what's influencing it. Out-migration is also the big factor, people moving out, which has been impacting that. Topeka economy now is a little bit more complex because you have the household side, but you have the labor market. And that labor market is all outside that county too, right? They're living in Lawrence, they're living over in Manhattan, they're living in a lot of those other places. So you can still have jobs in Topeka, just people are choosing to move out, and that's impacting the overall the population numbers. Good question.
And I think your estimate for Ellis County was for some increase over that same period of time.
There you go. Most people are mad at that. Most counties are not doing that great. So, yes.
This is maybe a little longer term question, but these government, the reason our economy is doing all right now is because of $3.5 trillion
Yep.
injected into it. Whether it happens again or not, I don't know. Long-term consequences to those type of injections
Yeah.
and the
Okay.
inability for what I'll term economic Darwinism to do what it does.
Yeah.
When does that end, and what do you view the long-term impact of all this deficit spending to be?
Okay. So I forgot to repeat the question for those people online because we have quite a few of them online. This question was about the federal stimulus and the longer-term impact of that federal stimulus on the economy. So I will first back up. Let's talk about short-term. It doesn't matter. You can hear both sides of Republican, Democrat, and other economists say it is needed, or we're going to have other deeper issues in the economy today, right? So it doesn't matter the political position. Everyone's saying that there's a lot of need for that. We disagree on the mechanisms of what's going on. Now the question is that long-term impact? Oh yes. You have to weigh what's the short-term gain from this versus the long-term costs. The United States has already had a lot of debt, and that's been struggling. Actually, there's a lot of weakness to the long-term growth for the national economy. But you can see most economists think right now the short-term value is there to spend it, which will have that burden on the economy in the long run. And it's going to affect us. It's going to hit us pretty hard, which means future programs will need to be cut, or the economy is going to have some kind of like pulling an anchor, right? It's slowing our economy down in the long run to pay that off. But I think in the short run, most people still think is that there is a value for this in the short run. Today, we need it. In the long run, we need to have. So let me switch this. Actually, the real issue is the spending during good times, not the spending during now. Right now, we need it. The problem is when our economy starts growing, if we pull back a little bit and then we're getting our deficit down, so that would probably change our trajectory. But we have a problem of paying it and then never really changing that off. And so that is weighing our long-term potential growth. Oh, it is definitely going to kick a can down. We'll come back to it. It's a cost that will be paid, and it will be weighed on some of people in this room, but definitely grandkids will have to pay that cost. If you look at overall debt to GDP, it has been going up, right? And I don't remember the latest one, so it maybe came down a little bit there. I can't remember. But we continue in the long run, continue to go higher and higher. And there were some concerns that if we get so high, we're going to lose a lot of other favorable trade issues through other countries. But a lot of economists have already dismissed some of those arguments. So a lot of economists think we have room to push that boundary a little further of that debt to GDP. But at some point, we're going to find we'll go too far. And we won't be the reserve currency, and then that would hurt the U.S. economy in the long run. And I will say I'm more on the fiscal conservative side, saying, yes, we need to get some of that debt down. But I don't think that's today, just to be clear. All right. Any other questions, or I move on a little bit? All right. I do this index, current index, and I do it for all the different communities around here. I hope you're looking at this. It's on our website. We update it regularly. These are the variables in here for Hays. We are including manufacturing wages, oil production, and farm proprietor income, right? Those are all good variables for this economy. Farming is important to it, oil is important, and manufacturing. In this Hays index, you can see that you had this peak back when oil and gas was doing really well. It had a massive drop, and I remember coming here during those periods of time, everyone was really grumpy. And it has been the steady growth all the way up into 2019, right? You don't feel as good as you did all the way back in, was that 14, but you've been improving every single year. And it doesn't go into COVID yet. Obviously, it's going to drop again when I get the latest data. It will be updated pretty soon. So overall, the economy had been improving. Here's employment year over year. I had some requests, particularly for this region, saying, what about the surrounding counties? So I put the surrounding counties on here. You can see Ellis, here's total population. Ellis is the largest, and here's Barton down here, the second largest area. You look at the growth area. I want to show you 0.9%. I know it's hard to put this in context. Just for Ellis, 0.9% is actually really strong growth for Kansas. This is really strong growth. You were adding a lot more jobs than the state was doing at the average. And then you go over down here to Trego and Ness. I think this Ness has been doing well for the last couple of years. I know I've talked to some people about that uncertainty, some of manufacturing because of oil and some other agriculture has been growing. And Barton is even growing. I know they were pretty upset about their economy, but it had been expanding as well for 2019. This is for the whole area. I took that whole previous map and said, what was the structure of the economy? And made this graphic to kind of visualize this. The biggest one is trade, transportation, and utilities. And a lot of it goes to the trade, which is retail trade. That's here in Ellis. You have a lot of retail trade. You serve a large market, and it drives this economy. Now, I put on here the employment for the region and for Hays to kind of give you a feel how Hays might be varying a little bit from the overall region. And you can see that of this region, construction was really coming up, and Hays hasn't had much of that construction lately. Manufacturing, however, has been picking up in this area. Another one that was picking up is you get down to local government, mostly because local government over the previous few years was declining there for quite a while, right? You struggled because oil and gas was going down. You had some issues with taxes, right? And now it's been coming back up because overall growth was behind the economy. This one is retail trade. I put employment in the top corner and retail taxable trade sales in the bottom. And this does not look like the state, by the way. The state does not look like this on the employment side at all. So you had this growth in employment all the way to 2017 and then started coming down. It really makes sense that it was coming down because taxable retail sales, by the way, went way up compared to the state and then has been coming down because of oil and gas. You can see that you were actually delayed by a month. For some reason, back in April, you were still consuming retail here. And then in May, it really dropped down and then came right back to where it was. So retail sales for where it's at right now is, we'll just say, is pretty flat except for that 1 month. Some pent-up demand from the month out, so maybe some of that will be respent here in the next few months. All right, so let me, here's pay. This was interesting. You know, and I look at this for a lot of different communities. There are some high paying jobs here. You have a higher wage than the region does. You have high wages in some of these sectors. In particular, was it finance I saw? Yeah, it was really high. Anyway, I put here the growth in the wages. This is average wage. And so you can have a few people that are really affecting it, but the growth in wages coming up. So you had some sectors that are really giving this price signals of, hey, we're ready to hire. By the way, this is not the same for other regions. You really had some price signals out there saying we're ready to hire. So if you see a massive growth like 6,000, I mean, that's a signal saying we're increasing and creating new positions in those areas. All right, here's population, and you have more details of the overall forecast. Here's the latest data. You're growing by 0.5%. Again, that's actually pretty darn fast for the state, particularly for 2019. That was really fast for the entire state. You're growing, adding more people. And I want to turn to this. Some of you may have saw our February forecast booklet, but since I wasn't out here, I couldn't share or talk about it. So what we did is we created this index of healthy, wealthy, and wise. We want to know how households were feeling out there, right? So I created this index. So you can see the components of it for healthy, wealthy, and wise. And I have one copy up here. If you don't remember some of the details, I'll share a few numbers, but not every number on there. Whoa, 2. Overall, for healthy, wealthy, wise, we had this region ranked as number 20, right? Out of 105 counties, you're ranked the 20th highest in the state. Now, I will say I hate rankings because I force someone to be 105, when in reality, there's probably a lot more flat where people are a lot closer to each other. But you're in the top part of the state when it comes to healthy, wealthy, and wise. And it's not because you don't have issues, because there's definitely some issues within some of your households that are struggling, but there are also some strengths. As I recall, I mean, one of your biggest strengths for households, you have this high income, you have this high education workforce that here as well, right? But you also have some high insured population, but then you have some other issues of income inequality, access, healthcare related issues, low births, things like that. There are the issues within the market. But overall, because of education and because of income, that makes this region rank pretty high on the household side. We did another one, which is business dynamism. I really want to get the churn, like how much are you killing off businesses and creating businesses, especially in a space like this. You want to see a lot of churn, how that entrepreneurial activity, but I don't have that one yet because this data is not there. So I did put two components, how fast is the businesses from the employment, establishment, payroll, and also how diversified the economy is. So the more diversified an economy, the more balanced it might be. So unfortunately, because you have a different economy, it doesn't sink in with the overall state economy, you look a little different, right? I'm looking over the last 5 years, and you already know what happened over the last 5 years of oil and gas that's weighing you down. So if I move forward, maybe this year or next year, you're going to be doing really well because I'm looking over a 5-year period. But because of that, that dropped you down to 48 because of what happened in oil and gas. It's kind of that legacy part of it, really slowing down the growth side. On the diversity side, it's much more diverse. You have a lot more options here for that from the retail side and leisure and hospitality that diversifies your economy with oil and gas and not just manufacturing. And you have some other segments, right? So that actually gives you some broader strengths to this economy. But the overall growth of the oil and gas just weighed you down when the rest of the state was actually improving. All right. I think I probably have 1 minute left if you have a question or two. Other than that, I'll turn it over. And Andrea, you're welcome. I'll have my phone right here, and you can send me a message if you'd like. Any questions at all? What about your labor market? How tight is this labor market here? Right? I know you've always projected to be a very tight labor market, and I keep pushing back because my signal is wages. Your wages is now coming up, right? There are some signals there that is tight as of 2019. How is that playing out now?
2.9% is the last state report for unemployment in Ellis County. I know particularly restaurants, hospitality, it's a very difficult time finding labor. Some have actually had to close because they don't have the labor force change their hours of operation. So I think labor is still a significant issue here. I don't know if everybody would agree with me. That's what I see. Yep.
One of our bigger problems in our town seems to be that we have a lot of Fort Hays is a blessing.
Yeah.
What I've been told by a lot of folks there is that students don't tend to work as much nowadays as they used to in the past. So that's creating a bit of a gap for specifically those industries that tend to rely on that type of labor force.
Well, you have a lot of food service and retail here, right? That's ideal for that labor market. Fort Hays definitely shifted to that online learning, which they don't have to physically be here, so you have less people physically there, right, being engaged. Yeah, right. The national trend is very clear. Out of all generations of those who work through college, this generation has not been working through college, and I think there's a big downside to their understanding about their future career, their ability to engage in the labor market, to understand what it means to really work hard. I mean, there's some issues there, and that obviously makes a gap. Not only they're not engaged, the parents are allowing them not to be engaged because they're paying for other services and they can be engaged in sports and things like that, other than being engaged in a job to pay through college.
It's the most reliable, the ones that are actually in the hiring is the juniors and seniors. It used to be get the freshmen, sophomores, very excited to work, and now saying that, and I don't know why that is, but the ones we're getting are definitely the ones that are here, year and a half, that's it. So, why it's definitely been one for hiring.
How much is teleworking going to solve your problem here? Or just productivity. I mean, you have software. How much could those really be the solutions to the issues you have here, right? There are people that are unemployed in the state. If you look at the urban areas, maybe they can still stay there and still work for you as a solution. Now, some jobs require to be physically present, right? And you can't get around that. But how much can that be the solution?
Might be some, but they can't wait tables or clean rooms. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're talking about low skilled is the biggest issue right there. But that's not the only one, because I did talk to other people that said it was not just low skilled as the problem here. It could be, it was more with at least technical skill and up, as someone else said.
Earlier, they have trouble finding heavy equipment operators for their operation. That's a skilled job.
Yeah.
And the county has had open positions for heavy equipment operators for a long time that they can't fill. So those are jobs you can't fill with teleworkers, obviously. There are some, certainly.
So the people who are online, and I'm sorry I'm not repeating it as well, is that the comment is that, yes, there are some heavy machinery. Was heavy machinery, is that what you said? Yeah, has been an issue that struggling in this community. All right. With that, I'm going to turn it over because I think I'm past time. Nope, right for break. There you go. Oh, we have some time.
All right, let's now take about 15-minute break. We'll be back here by 12:30. Is that correct?
Yes.
So that we can be on time for the second presentation. All right?
All right, thank you.
How are you?
Good.
Excellent. Excellent job as always.
Go on right now. You can turn it off. Right there. Press and hold. No, it's all right. Oh. No, you're not at all. This door had slipped and come open, so it hit this a little bit. So, no, that's all right. That's absolutely fine. Okay.
Let's have a big group today. These guys and those online.
Yeah, that's a great group. Excellent. Remind me, Dulce, where are you from originally?
I'm originally from Togo.
Togo.
Yes.
Okay. So I was guessing that it was a former French-speaking, yeah. And I didn't remember if it was the Congo, which it's not, because I had a friend who used to be a pilot in the Congo and was there for a couple of years. So, but
it's a French-speaking country, so I speak French.
right. You probably speak at least 4 languages, I would guess.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. Well, I speak French, my local dialects.
Mm-hmm.
I speak English.
Right.
And another language called
Mati.
Batu.
Okay. Yeah. My understanding is usually in any of the Central African or West African countries that there are multiple local dialects that can be very different. They're not just dialects, they're different languages.
In my own country, it's a small country.
Right.
But we have about 20 local dialects.
Right.
So if you, from the south, if you move in a bit to the south, the central part, then you can't understand it.
Yeah.
Unless, you speak French.
Yeah.
The French language is the only thing that really
is unifying, yeah. So is there anything else about the country that unifies it other than the fact that the French drew lines on a map?
Yeah, nothing really.
Yeah.
We all, came from different parts.
Sure.
Togo used to be a bigger country.
Mm-hmm.
But after the Second World War, it was divided into 2. One given to France, and the other part given to England.
Okay. And what was the English part then?
The English part now is connected to Ghana.
Okay.
So
okay.
Now Ghana become a bigger country, we are now a smaller country.
Okay.
It was very unfair, but we can't even say it.
So, yeah, I think Jeremy will just keep talking if you don't stop him. So.
It's 12:30. Let's get back to our seat for our next speaker.
For the online folks.
Yeah, okay. So our next speaker is Dr. Stan Longhofer with the Local and State Real Estate Outlook. He's the founding director of the Center for Real Estate at Wichita State University. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Longhofer. Thank you.
I guess I can go ahead and take off my mask now, so I'll do that, and let us get started. Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I always enjoy coming back to Hayes, and this is a wonderful facility. We haven't been here before. Last time I was in Hayes, my wife and I came to actually watch a high school musical, and we stayed overnight, and we raided a little restaurant. I think it's just across the railroad tracks here, a wonderful little breakfast brunch place that we had in the morning. So we enjoy. I don't remember the name, but I remember we enjoyed it a great deal, and so like I said, I enjoy coming to Hayes. And it is my pleasure to be presenting this year's Kansas Housing Markets Forecast. You should have a copy of our Hayes Housing Outlook. It's the Ellis County is the data that we include in that. And that should be at your tables. And then upstairs, you will find copies of the large forecast booklets that we do for all of the major markets, the metropolitan areas across the state, which includes Kansas City, Lawrence, Manhattan, Topeka, and Wichita. And so please feel free to take those. We have generous sponsors throughout the region that help pay for these publications, and so we're very grateful for that. But I need to make a special note of thanks to the Kansas Association of Realtors and all of the realtor boards across the state, including the Hayes Board of Realtors. We have a contract with the Kansas Association of Realtors whereby we tabulate monthly MLS, multiple listing service statistics, for every MLS system across the state. And as a result, we are able to have access to those data, which allows us to do this annual forecast series. But it also means that local housing market statistics are available. And if you're interested in more details about the Hayes area and the housing statistics there, I'd encourage you to contact the Hayes Board of Realtors, because they receive monthly reports that it's up to them to decide how they distribute them, but I think they make them generally available. And so if you were with us last year when we were here, this is a slide from my presentation. And I said at the current moment, housing market I look at two fundamentals to project what will be happening in housing markets going forward. One of them is the labor market, and the other is the mortgage market. Do people have jobs, and can they get financing to be able to purchase a house? And last year I said the fundamentals are really solid. Mortgage financing is widely available and cheap. I said it's historically low interest rates, could never get lower than they are right now. And I said labor markets are pretty healthy. But I ended my discussion of that with the statement that all of this could change fairly quickly. And there was a little bit of a concern that maybe wasn't quite sure what could happen, what might be waiting on the horizon, but somehow it felt like you had to look over your shoulder because something bad would happen. Jeremy talked a little bit about how nobody predicted COVID. None of us could have guessed what it was, but I'll take at least a little bit of credit saying something could change quickly. We as economists are put on earth to make the weather forecaster look good. So when we have at least one thing that's marginally right, we have to take credit for it. So Jeremy talked about the labor market, and he talked about concerns that we have broadly about this. And the concern that I really want to point to is that so far, housing markets don't appear to have been affected at all by the job losses. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. But the job losses that we've seen so far and the most heavily impacted, there are two things that I think have made that muted on the housing market. Number one is that we did have some extraordinary stimulus that helped replace income for a lot of people. And so we didn't see some of the stresses that we might have seen. But number two, those households that were most likely to have been affected, you saw those industries that Jeremy pointed out that had the strongest job losses. Those are also industries where the individuals in them are least likely to be home buyers. And so those two things together have muted the impact of the job market stress on the housing market. I will say that I'm concerned that as we go forward and the impact of the recession begins to spread into other segments of the economy, and you saw that again a little bit in that beautiful mosaic chart that Jeremy put up that said it was too small to read, but it painted a picture of who was impacted initially and then who was being affected as we went forward. As we go forward, my fear is that we're going to see broader impacts of the labor market stress that will begin to impact the housing market going forward. Again, I'll talk about that, but right now, things are pretty good, haven't been too bad, at least from the labor market perspective. From a mortgage market perspective, it's been stunning. Again, I said a year ago, so I take credit for the thing that I sort of got right. I'll have to take blame for the thing I got wrong. No way rates could get any lower than they were a year ago. And of course, here we are, they're even lower. And the thing that I want to point out here, so two things on this slide. Number one, the orange line here at the end is the Mortgage Bankers Association's forecast of the 30-year fixed mortgage rate. And the Mortgage Bankers Association right now is forecasting that the fixed rate for long-term fixed rate will stay below 3.4% through the end of 2021. So no projection of that going up in any time soon. The second thing that I wanted to highlight here is that you will notice the bluish line on the bottom is the 5/1 adjustable rate. That's a mortgage where the interest rate is fixed for 5 years, and then it adjusts annually after that. And like any adjustable rate mortgage, that presents less risk for the lender because they don't have to bear that long-term interest rate risk. And especially at a time when you're seeing long-term rates decline, you might expect that that interest rate risk is going to be pretty severe. After all, you lock in a mortgage right now, and weekly rates, I think most recent were about 2.75%. They're below 3% right now. You lock that in for 30 years. If rates go up in the future, that's a lot of interest rate risk for the lender or for the investor who holds that mortgage long term. And so you might think that the 5/1 adjustable rate might be a little bit more attractive from a lender's perspective. But you'll notice that recently here, the spread between the 5/1 adjustable and the 30-year fixed rate has essentially gone to zero. And what that's reflecting is the fact that long-term rates are going down because the Fed has ramped up again its purchases of mortgage-backed securities. And so that 30-year rate is being driven down, in a sense, artificially because of the activities of the Federal Reserve. If you'll recall, they had begun these purchases of mortgage-backed securities in the wake of the financial crisis, trying to help shore up the housing market and also trying to help stimulate the economy through purchases and through housing, trying to stimulate the economy by stabilizing the housing market and making it possible for homeowners to borrow against that. They had been weaning themselves back from those mortgage-backed security holdings, and that has changed ever since the pandemic hit. And so we can see that in this chart. So those were the two things that I wanted to highlight from here. Nonetheless, these low mortgage rates have definitely had an impact in the housing market, and I'll show you where we're seeing that here in a few moments. So what's been happening to home sales activity across the state of Kansas? Well, the blue bars in this chart represent actual sales through multiple listing services across the state of Kansas by month. And you can see we've got that typical seasonality that's going. The home sales go up in the spring and they tail off in the fall. And so to see through that, I've put a moving average line on here. It's a 12-month moving average. It gives you a sense of the underlying trend. And what we can see over here, and I guess on this side, I'm a little better to kind of point to exactly what's happening most recently. Sorry if I'm blocking you over there. I deal with that with my students too, right? We got a round room and students sit on the corner and it's like, well, I got to stand somewhere. So you're going to get blocked a little. By the way, if you can't see it, my slides are posted both on the CEDBR website or posted on the Center for Real Estate website at wichita.edu/real estate. And so you can download these as we go and look at those. So what have we seen with home sales activity? Well, if you were at this conference last year and the year before, we really said home sales are beginning to plateau. They're slowing down. They're not growing at a very fast rate anymore, just a little bit. And essentially, we've been seeing more of the same. Well, there was a slight drop off in home sales in the wake of the pandemic. It wasn't very much. And we're just trying to keep our head above water in terms of continuing to grow home sales activity. What does that look like for Ellis County and the Hayes area? Well, actually, you've seen pretty strong increases in home sales activity over the past year. And It's an interesting story as to why there's a difference between Hayes and the state as a whole. And that comes down to inventories. And so we measure balance in the housing market through a number called month supply. We take the number of homes that are actively listed and is available for sale at any given point in time, and we divide that by the average pace of sales over the past year. So for example, if there were 1,000 homes for sale in a given market, and on average we were selling 200 homes a month, we would say 1,000 divided by 200, that's a 5-month supply. And generally we think that a balanced market is a market in which the month supply is somewhere between a 4 and 6 month supply. So that's this shaded region that I show here on this graph. Between a 4 and 6 month supply is balanced. It doesn't favor buyers, it doesn't favor sellers. And so on this, I've shown you the Hayes area, which is this orange line that was up above the shaded region here for a number of years. The blue line is the United States as a whole, and the yellow or gold line is Kansas. And for Kansas, we've been in what would be considered a seller's market now for over 5 years. Incredibly tight inventories, inventories that are now down below a 2-month supply, levels that we never imagined possible. There are some markets in the state where they have less than a 1-month supply of homes available for sale. Bidding wars are happening, multiple offers above list price. It's a very, very aggressive competitive market. Hayes has been a little bit different. You've had a little bit more flush inventories over the past several years. Across the state as a whole, home sales activity, demand has been incredibly strong, but home sales haven't been able to increase because there's just nothing out there to sell. If there were more inventories, more homes would sell. In Hayes, because you had a little bit of inventory, you've been able to increase sales over the past year. And one of the things you'll notice is that you've gone from what might have been considered to be more of a buyer's market prior to 2019 and earlier. Over the course of this year, your sales have picked up tremendously without a lot of additions to inventory. And so you're now in what would be considered the lower end of a balanced market. Okay. Again, the big difference between the states, Kansas as a whole, and the Hayes area is the fact that you had some inventory to work with when this demand picked up here. And again, part of the reason for this increase in demand is the low interest rates that we're seeing. Now, not every home is the same. One of the challenges with the housing market is that we talk about averages, but nobody owns the average Ellis County home. Everyone owns a home that's in a particular neighborhood, in a particular location in a neighborhood. And so sometimes I try and break this out by looking at different segments or submarkets. And one way we could do this is by price ranges. And so I broke Ellis County data into 4 different price ranges. And these were relatively arbitrary price points, but I was trying to capture kind of the lower end of the market, the middle of the market, probably the most popular price ranges, the upper middle, and then the high end. And for this purpose, I picked $100,000, $200,000, and $300,000 list prices as my cut points. And so what you can see here is that for more modestly priced homes, we'd been a little bit, into perhaps what was a buyer's market range. For homes priced below $100,000, that's the orange line. The green line is between $100,000 and $200,000, and the bluish line was between $200,000 and $300,000. But that yellow line, which is the top end of the market, had been the place where inventories were really flush, okay, where you had a lot more inventory. But in every single price point, we've seen those inventories tighten up over the past year. And so that's the story that I see here from this. So what does that mean for our home sales forecast? We don't forecast every county across the state. We forecast the state as a whole and the large metropolitan areas. But for the state of Kansas as a whole, we're forecasting a very modest increase in home sales activity this year. And that is limited primarily by the fact that inventories are so tight across so many markets. Sales would increase more if only we had more inventory available for sale. We're forecasting a slight decline next year. This isn't a dramatic drop-off, but a modest drop-off. And it's really due to two reasons. Number one is the continuing tight inventories. But number two is my belief that we're going to see the economic fallout begin to spread more broadly and begin to have more of an impact on those on the home buying segments of the economy, not just those who are in jobs that are less likely to be homeowners. So before I move on here, first of all, I want to let my good friend Errol here tell me what have I said that's wrong, because I sometimes joke. What I do in my job a lot is I go around and I talk with realtors and I listen to what they have to say. And then I come back and I repeat what they've told me. And everybody thinks I'm really smart when all I am is being a parrot. And so, Earl, what have I said that's right? What have I said that's wrong? Oh, he's very nice to me. He says I'm right on. That's very kind of you, Earl. Okay. So home sales activity, again, we're forecasting that it will be up slightly this year, down slightly next year. And I'm a little bit worried about the longer term impacts of the underlying economy on housing demand. But so far, the labor market hasn't really shown any detrimental impacts to housing markets across the state. By the way, I'll take just a note here because I saw it this morning, an article in the Wall Street Journal that was essentially saying the same story nationwide. It said that housing markets have sort of defied the economic downturn being really strong, but there may be reasons for concerns that it won't last long term. I will say I did not believe that the housing market was going to see a sharp downturn this year when we saw the COVID hit, simply because inventories were so tight and we were in such a solid situation coming into the downturn. And so even as we see home sales activity decline next year, I don't believe that's going to put us into a situation of a buyer's market. We're so far skewed towards tight inventories that the only thing that reduced sales activity is going to do is push us into more of a balanced market situation. And so that's why I don't think home sales are going to drop dramatically at this point. So what do we think will happen with home prices? Well, when you have a situation where you've had strong demand like what we've seen, and you see very limited inventories, we should expect very strong home price appreciation. And indeed, this is the year-over-year percentage change in the Federal Housing Finance Agency's home price index, which is an apples-to-apples comparison of kind of the same home and how much it's appreciated from one year to the next. And you can see here that the U.S. typically is more extreme. During the downturn back in the housing crisis, you saw some sharp declines in U.S. home prices, and then really healthy appreciation, above 5% a year on average for a number of years. Kansas typically trails behind the U.S. as a whole, but over the last year or so, we've been as strong as the rest of the country. And that's unusual because we don't have the land constraints that many parts of the country have. But what's the most interesting story here is this orange line, which is what I call rural Kansas counties. That's really not fair. Hays is not a rural area. This is a measure of every county in Kansas that's not a part of a metropolitan area. So you take the counties around Wichita that are in the Wichita MSA, the Kansas City MSA, Topeka, Lawrence, and Manhattan. If you take those out, and then you ask what's happening with typical home values in every other county in the state of Kansas. That includes all of Northwest, all of Southwest Kansas, most of North Central Kansas, Southeast Kansas. A lot of differences across these areas. but the home price appreciation over the past year or so has jumped up to be on par with what we've seen across the state. Really strong home price appreciation over the last year or so. Typically, dropping down maybe 2.5%, that's much more typical for what we would have expected. So we don't have an index specifically for Ellis County or Hays, but one way we can get at underlying trends of home prices is to look at the median sale price. The median sale price is the price at which half of the homes sell for more and half of the sales I can say that, can't I? Half of the homes sell for more, half of the homes sell for a lower price. Okay? And what we've seen here, Hays typically has some of the higher median sale prices of homes in any part of the state. Home values here can be high compared to Lawrence or Kansas City in some instances. Very, very high cost of housing here. But median sale prices had been dropping just slightly over the last couple of years. And this year, maybe just starting to tail up again. Again, that's reflective of the higher inventories that we were seeing the last few years, and then the tightening of inventories more recently. So not as dramatic as we've seen in some other parts of the state, but still some modest appreciation this year. So what's our forecast for home price appreciation? We're forecasting that home prices across the state are going to be increasing at a very healthy clip, 4.8% this year, and another 5.7% next year. Again, a lot of that being driven by the large metropolitan areas, including Kansas City and Wichita, with very strong home price appreciation. The last thing that we forecast is new home construction activity for the state as a whole. And again, if you've seen me here in the past, I've said you'd think we've got strong demand for housing, tight inventories, home prices are appreciating. We ought to be seeing increases in new home construction. And for a number of years, that just hadn't been happening. And the reason, I'm going to go back to my home prices chart here, is that if you actually go past this slide, you go back over here, not just 2013, 12, 11, but let's go back to 2010, 2009. We had seen home prices across the state of Kansas that were essentially flat or modestly declining. We'd have a year where it may have been, minus 0.2%, but then the next year plus 0.6%. But it just bounced around zero for a lot of years across the state. At the same time, construction costs of new homes continued to increase. Labor became more expensive. Materials got more expensive. And what that meant is that there was an increasing gap between what it would cost to build a new home versus what you could buy in looking at an existing home. And what I've said is we just need to have more years of this solid home price appreciation to get to a place where existing homes are getting more expensive, at least as expensive as new homes are, to make them more competitive. And what we've finally seen now is that we are actually in a place, especially when we're looking at the Kansas City market and the Wichita market, but we're seeing it in all of the large markets across the state, of some reasonably healthy new home construction permits. We're forecasting a 12.1% increase this year, but a 21% increase next year. We're really seeing some strong growth in construction activity. And again, we think it's due to two things. Number one is the fact that existing home prices are finally starting to get to a place where it's not so much of a gap between what you can buy with an existing home versus a new home. New homes are more competitive as a result. But I also think this is being driven in part by the incredibly low interest rates. And there are more buyers that are in a position where they're saying, if I can get my forever dream home and build the home that I never thought I could have before, and I can do it now because of these low rates, maybe I'll go ahead and stretch and I'll push myself into that. And so that also is having an impact of increasing the number of permits across the state. Yeah, lumber is an issue, right? We've had some really sharp increases in the cost of lumber. That's going to happen when you actually take all of the piece of the cost of a home. That lumber has a meaningful impact, but it's not like if lumber costs go up 50%, that the cost of construction goes up 50%. It's one component of many components. One big one is labor that go into that building site. So it makes it a little more difficult to build, especially at the lower price points. But we're closer to being able to build, say, a $250,000 home. That was hard for a lot of years. You just could not build a $250,000 home that was in any way comparable to what you could find in the existing home market. And that spread has gotten less in recent years. So that is the summary of our forecast. Again, modest home sales increase this year with a slight decline next year as the economic environment weakens. Building permit activity is going to continue to be relatively strong, and home price appreciation at a very healthy clip, because even as we see demand tail off a bit in the existing home market, we're not going to see it drop enough to flip us from this seller's market that we've been in. We do have forecasts for all the major markets across the state. And with that, I think, do I have time for questions? I do. So any questions, comments? Yes.
So go back 2 slides. That one right there. So take a look, I guess explain 2021 there. Total home sales are going to decrease. Yeah, look at the permits to build a new home. So is that telling me that more people are going for the new home, or is it just you're not going to have to use home to purchase?
So yeah, so the question here is, if you look at what we're forecasting here, we're forecasting a slight decline in existing home sales next year, although this does include new homes. It's both new and existing, total home sales. But we're forecasting a very strong increase in new home building permits. And yes, that's reflecting a transition. Part of the challenge we've said, existing home sales would have been increasing at a lot healthier clip if there were only more homes available for sale. And part of that has been the fact that we've not been building them ever since the financial crisis. We're still at levels of building permit activity for single family homes that are about half of what they were at the peak. Okay, so we have not been adding to inventories in ways that are really necessary to meet the needs in the market. And so there's room for new home construction to happen even as we're softening. And again, this decline in home sales activity is not a very sharp decline. It won't be enough to move us. When we're sitting with about a 2-month supply, maybe we'll get close to a 4-month supply, but that's still the bottom end of balanced, where we should be adding more construction activity. Other questions? And I don't know how I would get questions from somebody who is with us remotely.
Send me a text.
So you can send send Jeremy a text, and we can. Okay, so if those of you at home, send in a chat box, and then they will forward it to me through a text message. So please, I want to answer questions if I can. I have a question in the back here.
You get all your information from MLS, is that correct?
No, home sales come from the multiple listing service. Okay, the single family building permits come from the U.S. Bureau of the Census. They do a monthly permitting and home starts and new home construction release. And then home price appreciation comes from the Federal Housing Finance Agency, which is the regulator that oversees Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And so that measure includes essentially any mortgages that are sold to Fannie and Freddie are used to estimate that home price appreciation. So
rural areas, Hayes being one.
yeah, I wouldn't call Hayes rural, but yeah.
The small markets don't have MLSs typically anyway. They may be part of the Dodge or Hayes MLS. For the most part, a lot of your numbers are based on MLS information in terms of the Kansas and some of that.
Yeah, I mean, as you go to some of the much smaller counties across the state, the coverage with which those will show up within the MLS can vary a great deal. But we have an MLS system that actually operates out of Goodland, right? And so we access the Goodland MLS. We access the Hayes MLS. We access the Great Plains, which is based out of Salina, but that also includes Great Bend. And so, for instance, one of the things we put together, Russell is a community where it kind of spans two different board jurisdictions. And so we actually combine the data off of both the Hayes MLS and the Great Plains Board of Realtors to be able to help them have some data about everything that's going on. But one question I think I hear underlying what you're asking is, what about homes that aren't sold with a realtor? Do those show up? And the simple answer to that is no, they don't show up here. That being said, when we've looked at this in the past, and I haven't looked at it in a little while, when you measure it based on sales validation questionnaires that go through that have to be filed every time that there is a transfer of a deed, the trends and patterns of home sales that show up in the MLS versus the deeds that are registered, the certificate of value questionnaires that are filed at the Register of Deeds office just go in lockstep with one another. Matter of fact, sometimes with the Wichita MLS, sometimes people ask me, oh, how do you think last month was? And it may be on the 1st or 2nd of the month. I'll say, oh, I think we're going to be up about 2% this month. And people think I'm really, really brilliant. But all I've done is I get almost right after the 1st of the month, the appraiser's office there sends me their certificate, their deed filings. And once I look at those filings of deeds, that's almost all residential, and I can predict pretty accurately there. So in short, we think that the underlying trends are very reflective. Okay. Were there any questions from anybody remotely? I had one more question here in the middle.
So it doesn't really affect Kansas that much that I've seen, but how is delinquencies and stuff if we go into more economic crisis, delinquencies, and then it obviously hits the financial sector and also some of the housing. I've seen big, Miami, New York, LA, Las Vegas, there's some like 5, 10, 15% delinquent right now, and we're kind of teetering with a lot of stimulus. How does that affect Kansas as a whole if there were a big spike in delinquency?
Yeah, so the concern has been, as you have people who have homes and they've been laid off, and if they're unable to make those payments, are we going to see a spike in delinquencies and then in foreclosures? And foreclosures are where we really care about it, because that's when that home is put back onto the market and often can have a very negative price impact, not only on that home, but also on neighboring homes because of the stress that it places. And I do think that that's a concern going forward, but it's not nearly the concern that we had when we were hitting the peak of the housing crisis back in 2008. And the reason is inventories are so tight. And so we never want to see homeowners go into foreclosure. We want them to be in a situation where they can resolve. Lenders, I think for the most, I will tell you this is one of those reasons why I always recommend to home buyers that you work with a local professionals of all sorts, whether it's a title company, whether it's a real estate, whether it's a mortgage company, a realtor firm, or whatever. And for mortgages, when you have somebody that you can go to and sit across their desk, even if I'm wearing a mask, that I can sit across their desk and talk about my issues, those local servicers and the lenders who are servicing it locally are much more able to kind of respond to the situation and deal with it. And in my conversations with lenders, at least in the Wichita area, they're really monitoring and looking closely. So I'm optimistic that that won't be a severe hit for us. And I think Jeremy's standing, which may mean that I'm out of time. And so with that, once again, encourage you to visit our website, and you can access all of our presentations and data that we have on Kansas real estate markets. So with that, thank you very much.
I'll let you introduce why I pulled this PowerPoint.
I would now like to introduce our final speaker, Jason Kennedy, Director of Health Services with the Ellis County Health Department. Jason will provide the health impact of COVID-19. So please join me in welcoming Jason.
All right. Can everybody hear me okay? Thanks for having me down. I will say WSU has been overly gracious. They've been on me for a couple months to get them not only my bio, but my PowerPoint. I got them none of it. I didn't do any of it until last minute. So I apologize to you guys for not doing my part, but they've done a good job of staying on it. And it seems like a really cool deal. So
Arrow forward, arrow back, just don't hit these buttons or it'll crash.
okay, perfect. So buttons that crash. Like I said, Jason Kennedy, Ellis County Health Services. So I am the director of the health department. I'm the director of EMS, and I'm also the public health officer for Ellis County. I took over in January, lucky me, right before the pandemic hit, after Carrie McHugh retired. So it's been a steep learning curve for all of us, myself included. I will say I appreciate that, honestly, this community is phenomenal. I've received way more support than death threats, which is not consistent across the state. And in all reality, there's 105 counties. I think 25% of the public health officers, the people that hold one of my jobs, 25% of them have quit since March. So we have another large group of them that have full-time detail or security details that have had death threats and everything else. So I've not felt that from this community, and I appreciate it. My staff has had some anger maybe voiced towards their way, but at least no death threats. So all in all, it's been pretty good. So situation report on the 2019 coronavirus outbreak. So I put this up here. Honestly, I don't mean to make light of COVID. We all understand the repercussions of COVID. We all understand the severity of COVID. We all understand the implications, the impacts, and everything else that we've all felt, you guys have felt in your businesses or medically or physically, financially, socially, psychologically, you name it, everybody has had an impact from this virus. Everyone is afraid of something from this virus. Whether they're afraid of the virus itself, whether they're afraid of losing their business, whether they're afraid of losing their freedoms, their rights, whether they're afraid of their kids being out of school, not being able to compete in football, whatever it is. Every person's afraid of something. As business owners, as someone in my job, I'm afraid every day that I'll make the wrong decision, that it'll put somebody at risk, it'll make someone lose their business, it'll take away from someone's freedom, their liberty, their whatever. Every single person shares some fear with this virus. So anytime you can smile a little bit or find something, I think actually the meme on this was if 2019 was a scented candle, this would be the scent, is what I saw. So, and as far as like 2020's economic projections, I'm not going to go into that because I'm not sure I'm great at my job. I'm sure not good as an economic forecaster, but I hope this isn't the economic picture of 2020 for us. So, you guys are here for economics, so we'll talk about numbers. Global summary, 40,890,000 and some change confirmed cases in the entire world. That represents 0.5% of the world's population is a confirmed positive of COVID-19. Just over 1 million deaths, which represents 0.01% of the world's population. Summary in Kansas, 74,400 cases. That's 2% of Kansas' population is positive for COVID. 952 deaths, which is 0.03% of Kansas' population. 1% overall mortality, actually a little over 1%. I know some of you guys are smart enough to figure that out in your heads. I'm not, but it's actually like 1.2%. Another caveat to my speeches, everything I say here today, you can immediately jump on your phone, Google, and you'll find something that completely contradicts what I just said to you. And the minute I leave here, everything absolutely could change because it's COVID times and it is what it is. 50% of the deaths in Kansas come out of long-term care settings.
And right now they're showing 11% mortality in long-term care residents. That doesn't include staff members, things like that, 11% mortality. And actually the mortality is significantly higher. In Ellis County, we have 1,300 cases. 4% of Ellis County population is confirmed positive, 16 deaths, which represents 0.05% of Ellis County's population. 1% overall mortality, it actually is right around 1.2, which is consistent with what we see nationwide. 90% of our deaths come from long-term care facilities. We actually have had a significantly higher percentage of death out of long-term care, is actually closer to around 20% of our confirmed positive residents with mortality. We have done 9,800 tests in Ellis County since the start of this. That actually makes us the eighth in the state for number of tests conducted per capita. So our testing rates have been up there. Testing has been a big concern from the start of this, really for everybody. We've never lacked testing in Ellis County. We've never lacked capacity to test. We've never not had sample kits. We've never not had the ability to do it. We are in the top 10%. Even if you use KDHE's numbers, we're in the top 10%. If you use our numbers, we're actually significantly higher, but it's hard to compare those because every county has their own numbers that are a little different than KDHE. So if you use KDHE numbers, we are in the top 10% of tests. There are 89 public health labs, and I actually think I think this is old data. There's a significantly larger amount of public health laboratories, and then there is a bunch of private labs that are also conducting testing. When I say testing, I use sampling and testing kind of interchangeably usually. So sampling is the process where you actually go and get the Q-tip and they jam it up into your brain and make you like screwy for a while. That's the sampling process. Testing actually happens at a lab. So those samples are sent off to a lab. We do not have an active lab in Hayes. Our samples are sent off to several different private labs. Now, we do have the capacity for rapid testing here. Rapid testing still has the sampling and the testing process, but the sampling process is where they jam your brain. Then they take it and they put it in a machine right there. So we do have some of those machines in town. So they're small scale labs, mostly at our long-term care facilities. Hayes Med has one. I believe KPS Labs has one. And there's a bunch more that are coming online with rapid testing. Kansas has tested over 605,000 samples. That represents 20% of the state's population, and it gives us an overall 12.2% positivity rate. Now, that positivity rate, if you compare it to like the positivity rate they talk about on TV, there's so many different numbers with this stuff, and everybody gets confused, and none of them really make sense. So this positivity rate is basically from March, when we started testing, till today. The number of tests that were conducted was 605,000. Of those, 12.2% of them returned positive for COVID-19. That means the remainder did not. Now, with positivity rates, what we generally look at, 2-week positivity rates or 7-day positivity rates, those are more of a moving indicator of viral transmission in your community. This is cumulative from March. The numbers that are important are the short-term 7-day to 14-day positivity rates. Kind of a graph. So this is the graph that KDHE famously likes to show. Obviously, the trend line here is total cases. If you're only looking at cases, it's never going to go down. There's no way to remove them. So like that line's always going to go up. As you can see, we've had several kind of waves, which is consistent with what they've seen pretty much nationwide and worldwide. Some of those waves or some of those peaks are longer. Some of them are shorter. Some of the breaks in between are shorter. What they generally represent is starts and stops of mitigation measures. Viral transmission doesn't really stop. It doesn't go away. To half-life or to remove a virus from a setting, it generally takes about 7 latency periods of the virus, which is 14 days. So you're looking at 100 and some days, say 120 days basically, to mitigate or to remove a virus strictly with social isolation, social distancing, whatever. Those measures would have to stay in place indefinitely until either the virus has a cure, has a vaccine, or your community just becomes 100% isolationist and you never go outside of your community. You never need resources from outside of your community. You in essence, close it up, shut down the doors, because the minute you travel outside of your bubble, you bring it back in. We see it with sports. Major League Sports is a good example. You know, they'll have a great track record for a long time. They've got their bubble, and then you find out some guys went to a strip club. All of a sudden, they've got it back in their bubble. So it's that's why some of these mitigation measures are difficult, because they have to stay in place indefinitely if you want to mitigate it out. So, date of death. So this is the graph of just cases. New cases, total cases. This is the death toll. It looks fairly similar. You kind of see the waves. The difference is as we see this wave here, significantly less cases per day, significantly lower than our peak. And as we look at the deaths, they really stay fairly consistent. So as we got more cases, and as we got more cases per day, our mortality index actually dropped. So meaning the percentage of the new cases per day that died actually dropped throughout the course of the virus. Now, there's several reasons maybe that could happen, but I'm not a doctor, and I'm honestly not going to go into a lot of that. There's treatments, there's better mitigation. We think viral load has a play in it, better hospital capacities. We figured out better ways to actually treat the virus. There's still no treatment for it, but we do see that the mortality index, or the percentage of new cases, actually has decreased with that mortality.
Well, that was my question.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, it's
more testing, and therefore more people who may not have been tested early because they were mild.
So there is yes, there's possibility here. So when you look at having limited testing capacity, we were strictly testing symptomatic people. Symptomatic people are generally going to have a high viral load, or a higher viral load, and they're going to have a more severe clinical course, I guess, for lack of a better word. Actually, that probably is the right word. I don't know. I'm not a doctor. But as you look at symptomatic people, if we're only testing symptomatic people, we're finding the more critical cases. As we go forward with this, we actually have a lot more asymptomatic testing coming on board. We have more availability to test, more access to test. We're going to have more cases. Now, these more cases is not just due to more testing, though. That's the everybody's like, well, of course we're going to find more cases. We have more testing. Yes, but over here we had a 5% of positive, and here we have a 15% of positive, which means we have more community transmission. More testing, more cases, more cases, more cases. We have more cases than we had then. But we have seen a reduction in mortality because we're finding a lot of mildly symptomatic or less symptomatic people. We're doing a lot of asymptomatic testing, and they've honestly found that they are better at treating. There's better ways to treat this than what we started with. Ellis County. So, statewide stay-at-home order. We weren't actually at 0 cases, but it's just so low it doesn't register on here. I think we had 1, maybe 3. I don't remember. It was low. Pretty much stayed there through the phase 1 reopening that happened here, phase 1.5 reopening that happened here, phase 2 reopening that happened there. Full open without restrictions, and we stayed fairly flat. This looks like more cases. It's actually like between here and here, it's like 15 or 20 cases total from March till here. 4th of July rolls around. We see our first, this is the first time that people went and did since really the first of the virus. People were good about the stay-at-home orders. People were good about staying home. There was high levels of fear. We didn't know what we were dealing with. The news media, everything was out there. We have bad short-term memories in this country. So up rolls Independence Day. It's beautiful out. It's great weather. We're finally free to go and do stuff. COVID-19 shows up in Ellis County. That's really the first time we had it. From Independence Day back, we had a few cases. Every single one of them was imported from somewhere. Somebody came from Oklahoma, stayed with a family member, whatever, then that person ended up positive. This person went to wherever, they came back, they were positive. But generally every case up to that point was an imported case. Independence Day, we get our first community transmission. Back then, that was like the most fearful word ever. I don't know how many times I got to ask about, is it what? Is it community transmission? Well, okay, yeah. So, community transmission happens. We see our first initial peak. Honestly, extremely similar to Kansas's data. So here's the statewide map. Ours looks almost identical. Stay-at-home orders here, phase 1.5 reopening here-ish, phase 2-ish, phase 3 reopening-ish, and then July 4th-ish. We're always a little bit behind what happens in the state. Statewide data is always a little bit ahead of us. The cities actually have seen transmission a couple of weeks, maybe a week and a half ahead of us. What happens there ends up here. Our data looks very similar. We ride to the peak here. We start looking at, actually things start improving. Things look better. Mask mandate comes into place. Everything kind of continues to improve slightly, following really the same lineage as what we've seen from the statewide data. 4-day state comes back. Trust me, I love 4-day state. I graduated from 4-day state. I don't put this up here to paint any negative light on them or on their students. They are phenomenal for this community, and I support them 100%. But we have a bunch of kids that come back. They're healthy. They've been locked up for 3.5 months at that point. We took their senior graduation from them. We took their sports away from them. We took their summer away from them. We said, hey, you guys hide out. And then we said, go. Get out of mom and dad's house. Have fun, be safe. Well, they're kids. They're good kids, actually. 4-day state's awesome. But 4-day state comes back, we see we see their entry testing. Obviously, our case is shot up, but it's not any different than what the state saw. And they didn't have 4-day state kids coming back. They had a lot of kids coming back. They had people moving around. They had people going on vacation. They had people that were wanting to do and go. So, if HSU stops their entry testing, here's Labor Day. No peak after Labor Day. No change after Labor Day. We've continued a downward progression. There's really not been much change in mitigation measures. We have seen a few ups and downs, generally based around some fear stimulus. And the reason I say it like that is as we see heightened awareness in the community or heightened fear from whatever the event is, generally an outbreak related to a wedding or something like that, we see a large number of tests following it within the next 3 to 4 days. With that, we can predict increases. If we have a large influx of testing, we're going to find cases. So that's what you see mostly in these ripples. We've continued to trend downward, which is good. This is our 7-day average. 7-day average of cases per day, basically, is what you're looking at here. And you guys probably can't see it, but this is about 10, 15, 20-ish, 25s around here. So it gives you kind of some context from where we were at in July when we had our initial peak and we thought things were going to go crazy, and then now we're here. So here's what we saw in January, February, March, April-ish. Well, actually, even before that, we kept hearing about flatten the curve, flatten the curve, flatten the curve. This was the intent. That was the intent of the impact of community mitigation measures. The intent was to take this peak, make it into that peak, terminate it out, and be done. That was the intent. It's the idea, the theory. It actually comes from flu pandemic planning, which is kind of what we had before this. In flu pandemic plans, it kind of works because flu generally has a seasonality to it. Coronaviruses don't. This is an animal derivative of coronavirus. Standard human coronavirus is the common cold. This is not the common cold, and this is not flu. So please don't take that away from here that that's what I'm saying. This works with flu because it has a seasonality. Generally ride the wave, you try to flatten the curve, mitigate it out as it mitigates itself out, lessen the impacts, hopefully get a vaccine for next year. That's what we did with H1N1. The predominant strain of flu last year was H1N1. The predominant strain of flu for the last several years has been H1N1. H1N1 was a global pandemic in 2009. We now have a vaccine for it, so we don't hear about it as much. It's the actual outcome of mitigation measures. That was the plan. It's the outcome. The plan worked here. We actually see it work. This is because of the statewide closure. This is because of all the stuff. Came to here, flattened it. Likely, this would have continued. I think that's a fair assessment. And we don't really know with any of this stuff. You don't know with viruses. Viruses travel in epicenters. If you never get your epicenter, if you never get your hub, it never comes to your community, you'll never have it. But once it's there, it spreads from that center. This center becomes a center over here. This center becomes a center over there. You see it spread from that point, that case. As we look at this, obviously, it did not mitigate itself back out. Mitigation measures have to stay in place indefinitely until you have a cure or vaccine. Ellis County numbers specifically. As we talked earlier, this slide maybe should have went back at the beginning. I don't know, I've never given this presentation before. So as we look at the numbers specifically, we've been fortunate in Ellis County that, as with most places in the state, that most of our cases have been in the population 18 to 24. They generally have a low burden of disease. They generally have a better clinical course. They generally don't have a high mortality, which is great with COVID. Cases in that population keep this red bar lower. This red bar is mortality. So in Ellis County, this shows you our mortality. 20%, 22 and a half, I think, or something like that mortality. So 20% in the 65 to 74, 22 in the 75 to 84, and then the vast majority, 75% of our mortality is in the population 85 and over. Now, we don't have a ton of numbers, so obviously a small input here makes a giant change, which is great. We don't want high mortality. As we see in our cases, though, the population 18 to 24 represents 38% of overall cases. K through 12 combined represent around 4%, I think, of total cases, and this is total cases throughout from March till now. Now, I put a little plug in here for public health. Public health has been thrust to the forefront of this. Public health has been something that has truly been maybe underappreciated, underutilized, has been really kind of pushed to the side, has lost a large market share of what they used to do, especially in smaller communities, your rural communities, used to go to the health department for everything. Now it's primary care driven. A lot of what happens at the health department had been gobbled up by Dillon's Pharmacy. I don't know why I always hammer on Dillon's. I don't mean to, but it's been gobbled up by the pharmacies. You know, you got your private pharmacies, everything like that. So a lot of the flu shots, flu clinics, that type of stuff. So in public health, since 2008, we've lost 23% of the workforce. It's over 50,000 jobs nationwide. And actually, that number is significantly higher following the pandemic. Just nobody has time to keep track of that stuff right now. Like I said, we've lost 25% of the public health officers since this. There's only 105 of us. 55% of the local public health officials are over 45. Over half, or over a quarter of them, are eligible for retirement. So what this means is the group that has been thrust to the forefront in this global pandemic has been tasked with making decisions for an entire community. is ready to retire, was already getting out, and is ready to get out anyways. So as we look at the impacts of COVID, I think this is going to be one of the biggest impacts, is what happens to this group. And what does this group, what is its impact on the community? There are no cures for COVID. These are the symptoms. We'll skip those because I'm running out of time. I like to talk a lot. Quick risk status. As you guys look at your organizations, as you look at your businesses, healthcare workers obviously are at an increased risk because they're around it pretty much daily. Close contacts. CDC just changed their definition of what a close contact is. They changed it. So CDC was 6 feet for 15 minutes, and it was a cumulative time, or a consecutive time, sorry. It was 15 minutes in like one setting. KDHE had stayed at 6 feet for 10 minutes since the start of this. CDC just came out and said, basically, it's cumulative time over 24 hours. So if you're within 6 feet of someone 15 times in a 24-hour period, and each one of them was around a minute, they're saying you're a close contact and would therefore need to quarantine. That's CDC guidance. KDHE is still 6 feet for 10 minutes, but what they're trying to lend towards or push towards is that this 6 feet for 10 minutes stuff, there's not, I'll be honest, there's about zero science behind that. Now, like I said, you can jump on Google and prove me wrong here pretty quick. There'll be 65 different articles that are not peer-reviewed and are a single-point case reference study with a population size of like 2 people that will prove me wrong, but so I'll be glad to fight with you that on the end. But what they're trying to say basically is if you're within close proximity of someone that has COVID, you can get it. It doesn't have to be for 10 minutes. It can be mere seconds. Now, that would have to be a highly infectious person. You'd have to take no mitigation measures, and you yourself would have to have really direct contact with the secretions so that you would have enough of a viral load to become infected. Why the time frame matters is because generally the only place you're going to have that level of contact is inside your home. We know that a predominant amount of viral transmission happens in the home because it's where we have that close contact. Kiss your spouse, you kiss your kids, whatever. That's where you get that close or that quick transfer. So as we look at those definitions, as you look at your businesses, figure out how to push that distance, how to push those people out as much as possible. How do you implement mitigation measures? How do you separate your workforce? We know CDC is pushing, and it has been for a long time. I don't know how CDC hasn't adopted it, but aerosol transmission, don't confuse that with airborne. Airborne transmission means someone breaks a vial of anthrax over there in the corner, and we're probably all likely to die in this room. So this is not airborne. It's aerosol driven, which means droplet nuclei. So it can hang or float for a short amount of time, but it doesn't travel over significant distances. It can get into some ventilation system stuff. You can spread it some that way, but it's not believed to be the predominant means of transmission. So we are still looking at those close or moderate contacts over some kind of a duration of time. So in your businesses, find a way to space that, find a way to push that out. Do everything you can to push that distancing. Looking at air handling systems, air exchange, all that kind of stuff helps to improve your situation. Community spread, you have about as great a risk of contracting it really anywhere in our community. I mean, it's unfortunate nobody wants to hear that, but in all reality, we just don't know. It's you don't likely get it from passing intermittent contact. So you're walking through the aisle of a store, you walk past someone, not likely you're going to get COVID that way. It is about that duration and that close range contact. Travelers, our cases are about as bad as anywhere else. So like, take the same measures if you have to travel, if you want to travel. Take the same measures there that you would here. Do what you can to protect yourself. But skip through some of this stuff. I think I'm out of time. Business guide. Everybody wants to know about their businesses. I'll take a minute to kind of run that through. So like in your business, it is extremely unlikely that I would ever close your business. I haven't closed a single business in this town, not by order or not by mandate. Unless you are negligent or willfully compromising someone else. So if you are just absolutely doing nothing, but you are saying, hey, all my COVID employees are coming back to work, no matter what. I don't care. I don't care about your isolation. You're coming back to work. We're not telling anybody. We're just going to do business as usual. Negligence, willful intent to infect, those type of things would be the only reason that I would ever close a business by order. Now, there's been businesses that have closed on their own, or they've called and talked to me, hey, what do you think about this situation, whatever. You guys are more than welcome to call me about any of that stuff. Contact tracing through your business looks no different than contact tracing in the standard environment. We'll go through, we'll work with you as the employer. There is some HIPAA stuff that we can't cross over, but we'll generally work with the employee. Hey, who did you have close contact with? What is the situation here? If it's a large impact to your business, then we would work with you. If you have a large number of employees that we cannot, there's businesses that people don't even know the person that's next to them. They don't know their name. They don't know anything like that. Small business, we'll work with the individual. We'll provide documentation to them. They can provide it to you, but it would be very unlikely that you would be closed by order. So as we do that, we'll pull those employees 14 days for close contacts, 10 days for the positive. It doesn't make sense that the positive only has to stay less than the contact, but with the positive, they've not been able to make live virus after 10 days. They think that the virus has run its course. They can't replicate more virus from that person after 10 days, meaning he's no longer able to spread it. Now, the 14 days is because the latency period of the virus. In essence, essentially, it could live in you. It could remain in you for up to 14 days. Then on day 14, you could become infected and spread it. It's not likely. Dutch data says 99% of cases actually are positive after 10 days. CDC data says around 95% of cases after 11 days. And the predominant amount of cases show up after 7 days. 3 to 7 days is the mean for reinfection or secondary infection. So that's all I got. You guys got questions for me?
But they were still exhibiting symptoms. What would the recommendation be? What should businesses do in that situation? Is it safe for them to come back to work, or should they stay home until they're asymptomatic?
So the positive after 10 days still has symptoms? Is that the question? So on the positives, you can return. We don't impose further quarantine for people that are mildly symptomatic or have a significant improvement in symptoms. Now, if after 10 days you have new onset of symptoms that are different, you continue to have a fever, your symptoms haven't improved at all, then, or if you're immunocompromised, there's several situations that we would lengthen that, especially fever, 72 hours post-fever. So if you could be asymptomatic 9 days and on day 10 spike a fever, you'll be in quarantine or isolation for another 3 days after that. But lingering cough, loss of taste and smell, which is funny because loss of taste and smell is what takes most people in to get tested, and it's like the last symptom you're going to get. Generally, you're already past the infection point and have spread it. But I guess that's not funny. It kind of sucks, but it is what it is. So that's generally later stage. But so loss of taste and smell, mild lingering cough, some kind of mild body aches, weakness, tiredness, those are kind of the lingering effects that we're seeing with people. And we won't keep people in isolation or quarantine because they're no longer contagious. They themselves might be uncomfortable, but they're not contagious.
We're over on time, so maybe you can answer his question on the side. And we can
Sure.
close out and thank our sponsors. And thanks for Hayes, by the way, for coming every year and participating.
So at this point, let's go ahead and begin on our speech. I think it did a good job. For you all, thank you very much for attending this conference. We hope you enjoyed all the presentations, and we hope to see you back next year. Thank you very much, and have a safe trip back.
Thank you.
Your turn.